from a quarantined city. Narrated by Arian Stanley and Morag Sims.
Wuhan is one of China's biggest cities, a major industrial and cultural hub. But the reason the city has been on everyone's lips is much more somber. At the end of 2019, Wuhan became the site of origin for the dangerous coronavirus that soon swept the entire world. The virus first appeared at Wuhan's downtown seafood market. It was highly infectious and quickly brought the bustling city to its knees. On January 23, 2020, Wuhan went into strict lockdown in order to stop the spread of the virus. The lockdown remained in place for 2.5 months. Along with 11 million other Wuhanese, celebrated Chinese writer Feng Fan found herself stuck at home. She chronicled her quarantine experience in a public diary, which she posted on the social media platform Sina Weibo.
The Bluetooth.
These blinks provide an intimate account of the pandemic's beginnings, from people's initial panic to their anger at the government's delayed response to the small joys in between.
Blink 1 of 7.
Many people outside China first heard about the coronavirus pandemic in February 2020. But in Wuhan, people knew something was up much earlier. Wuhan, the capital of the Hubei province in China, is one of the country's largest industrial hubs. It's also the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak.
The key message here is, the government initially played down the crisis, so the quarantine order came as a shock.
Author Feng Fan has lived in Wuhan for over 60 years. She first heard rumors of a strange new virus in December 2019, weeks before the rest of the world found out about it. The information was patchy since Chinese media is heavily censored. Privately, people had started sharing videos of the closed Huanan seafood market where the virus first broke out. One online post claimed that this new pathogen was related to earlier SARS viruses. But for a long time, the official line was that people had nothing to worry about. By January 10th, intensive care beds in many hospitals were filling up with coronavirus patients. But the people of Wuhan remained in the dark. The government sent 2 teams of specialists to investigate. They inspected the Wuhan Central Hospital, located closest to the seafood market. Afterward, one of the specialists, Dr. Wong, made a public statement describing the virus in 8 fateful words. The virus, he said, was not contagious between people, it's controllable and preventable. This would prove to be a tragic misconception. The media never probed further. Instead, it followed the government's official assessment of the situation. The press repeated Dr. Wong's 8-word statement over and over. Journalists chronicled various mass events in the city, like a government banquet at which 40,000 people celebrated the new year, without critique. The day after this banquet, infectious disease specialist Dr. Zhong Nanshan revealed that the virus could be transmitted between people after all. By then, the government could no longer conceal the severity of the situation. To stop the spread of the virus, the authorities ordered a complete lockdown of the city, beginning on January 23rd. For many people in Wuhan, the quarantine order came as a confirmation of their worst fears. The author remembers the panic she felt over the first few days of the lockdown. Along with 11 million other Wuhanese, she was stuck at home. For weeks, she would have nothing to do, except write about her new experience.
Blink 2 of 7.
Fun spent lockdown in her apartment, located in the Literary and Arts Federation compound in Wuhan. For the 76 days of isolation, her only companion was her 16-year-old dog. And in the virtual world, Fun's online followers kept her company. Fun is an active user of social media. So, when one of her editors suggested that she start recording her quarantine experience, she decided to do it publicly. She chose to document it on Sina Weibo, the Chinese equivalent of Twitter. Fun began the diary on January 25th, the first day of the Chinese New Year, 2 days into the lockdown. By late March, when she ended the diary, some of her posts had over 10 million views.
The key message here is, in the beginning, Wuhan was gripped by panic and despair.
The first days of lockdown were chaotic and stressful. Usually the beginning of the Chinese New Year is a busy and joyful time. But this time, the streets of Wuhan were deserted and its citizens terrified as the number of infections kept growing. All traffic in Wuhan was shut down, so patients had to walk to hospitals. And when they arrived, they were often turned away. The medical system was simply overwhelmed. There wasn't enough protection for doctors either. The city was running out of face masks. A friend who worked at the hospital told Fun that a lot of smaller clinics only had enough supplies for 2 or 3 days, and many were short on staff. In the first 2 weeks, dozens of heartbreaking photos and videos circulated online. Some showed infected people collapsing right in the city's streets. Others were testimonies of doctors and nurses barely able to cope. But it wasn't just the virus itself that took its toll on the people of Wuhan. The government's hasty response to the epidemic caused a great deal of suffering too. One online report told of a special needs child who had died of starvation in his own home after his father had been ordered to quarantine elsewhere. The many peasants and migrant workers of Wuhan could no longer work, but they couldn't leave the city either. For many, this meant going without food and shelter.
Blink 3 of 7.
In early February, the outbreak in Wuhan hit its peak. Every day brought more cases and more fatalities. But as the spring sun came out and flowers and trees around the city started blooming, Fun felt that people were growing optimistic. Help started pouring in. Families and communities were devising new ways to stay connected, to keep each other safe and healthy.
The key message here is, people started helping each other in new and unexpected ways.
Like many other Wuhan citizens, Fun used the internet to stay in contact with friends and family. She relied on online messaging and social media platforms such as WeChat and Sina Weibo. These channels were a way to share news, jokes, and stories. And the people of Wuhan also started to help each other in the real, offline world. Young volunteers delivered food and supplies to older residents of their neighborhoods. Many communities organized shopping groups to place wholesale grocery orders. As an older woman in the high-risk group, Fun also felt the support from her community. At the beginning of the lockdown, a good friend brought her several packs of masks, which she distributed among friends and family. Her neighbors left her traditional Chinese medicine for her ailments and freshly cooked meals. Fun, too, was doing her bit, trying to lift people's spirits with the online diary. She reminded her readers to stay positive, grit their teeth and soldier on. She also told them that staying inside and taking care of themselves was the best thing they could do for their fellow citizens. Things were improving. A number of temporary hospitals opened throughout the city. The government brought in a new system of quarantine measures, which divided patients according to their symptoms. All of this eased the burden on the medics. Other regions in China, and the rest of the world, were finally taking notice of the situation in Wuhan. Help was now at hand. 20,000 medical workers and countless other volunteers arrived from across the country. Japan donated truckloads of food and medicine. Pittsburgh, Wuhan's sister city in the US, sent over 180,000 face masks. And finally, the medics too could share some good news. It had become clear that people with mild infections were recovering quickly. And for the seriously ill, American drug remdesivir offered new hope. Made by Gilead Sciences, a pharmaceutical company, it appeared effective against the virus.
Blink 4 of 7.
About 3 weeks into lockdown, all the efforts of the Wuhanese and all the outside help seemed to be paying off. The infection rate was slowing down. The virus's mortality rate had steadied at around 2% of those infected. There were also fewer people with severe symptoms. But the government was adamant that Wuhan should remain under lockdown until the situation was fully under control. On February 17th, the authorities issued a new quarantine order. It was even stricter. Now only one member of each household was allowed to go out for groceries, and only once a week. By now, people were growing restless. Fun's own mood swung between optimism, exhaustion, depression, and increasingly, anger.
The key message here is, further into the lockdown, people started demanding answers.
Following the initial shock, Fun and her fellow citizens had a lot of time to think about how officials had handled the situation. Why had it taken authorities so long to admit that the virus was contagious? Who was responsible for the delay? There were many questions. Fun remembered the SARS outbreak that had occurred in March 2019, and how the government had also tried to conceal that disease from the public. Even though a few low-ranking local officials in Wuhan were fired, no one in the Chinese government was willing to step forward and accept the blame for mishandling the coronavirus. People's discontent mounted when, on February 6th, one of the city's most famous doctors succumbed to the virus. Dr. Li Wenliang was one of the 8 medics who had warned people about the virus early on. He was then silenced by the Chinese government. On the social networking site Sina Weibo, Dr. Li's profile page transformed into a wailing wall for people's anger and frustration. And the virus itself remained a puzzle. Only 30 to 50% of people infected with the coronavirus seemed to show any symptoms at all. But when they did, the infection often led to lasting damage or death. Even though specialists claimed that the virus was most dangerous to old and chronically ill people, it also killed many who were young and healthy. Because of its unpredictable and changing nature, scientists dubbed it a rogue virus.
Blink 5 of 7.
In her online diary, Fun spoke freely and critically about the government's response to the pandemic. She felt that, as a writer, it was not her job to fawn over officials. Instead, she wanted people to grapple with her own experience of the situation by voicing the questions and concerns of people around her. For example, when one politician made coronavirus patients join him in singing the Communist Party anthem for a publicity stunt, Fun questioned whether such displays of party affiliations should really take priority during a national crisis.
Key message here is, as her online diary grew more popular, Fung became the target of censors and trolls.
Fun already knew that speaking out in China often comes at a price. Her novel, A Soft Burial, had been banned because it criticized the government's tactic of suppressing parts of Chinese history for political benefit. She was also used to censors taking down her online posts or temporarily suspending her social media accounts. While Fun was writing the diary, her Sina Weibo account was blocked for several days. But she worked around the blockage, instead sharing her writings in private groups on the messaging service WeChat. Fun's critical diary didn't just draw the attention of censors, it also attracted another group of adversaries, online trolls. Their attacks started when a fellow Weibo user accused Fun of circulating what he said was a fake photograph, an image of a pile of cell phones at a crematorium. The phones had been taken from people who had died of the virus and whose bodies had been hastily cremated. But the troll insisted Fun had manipulated the photo to make the situation look worse than it really was. Fun threatened to sue for libel, and the troll deleted his post. But he soon came back, this time with a whole army of trolls. Posts and articles appeared accusing Fun of spreading lies and rumours. Trolls complained that she never used full names when writing about her friends. They suggested it was suspicious. They also accused Fun of fabricating stories. As the lockdown continued, online attacks escalated. But Fun didn't back down. She adopted a motto from a book she'd once read. Don't leave the world in the hands of the bastards.
Blink 6 of 7.
The infection rate of the virus began slowing down in early February. But the real turning point came much later than experts had predicted. Outside of Hubei, the province in which Wuhan is located, there had only been a handful of coronavirus cases. And by February, the infection rate was beginning to decrease. But in Hubei and its capital, Wuhan, cases continued to rise despite the strict lockdown. The infection rate had slowed down, sure, but it hadn't yet reversed.
The key message here is, despite the strict lockdown, it took a long time for things to get better.
One reason for the sluggish improvement in Wuhan was that the response had been so delayed. Many infected people couldn't get treatment until it was too late. And the hundreds or even thousands of doctors, nurses, police officers, municipal staff and volunteers who'd been working around the clock remained at risk. At Wuhan Central Hospital alone, 200 medics had been infected by mid-February. Almost every day during the quarantine, Fun received news of friends and acquaintances who had lost someone dear. Many older professors from her alma mater, Wuhan University, succumbed to the disease. Sometimes entire households were destroyed by the virus, like the family of young nurse Liu Fun, her brother and both her parents. At times, Fun felt that people, as she put it, didn't have enough tears left to mourn all these deaths. As the lockdown dragged on, people began to worry about the secondary disasters that coronavirus could create for the city. There were, for example, economic concerns. The strict quarantine meant that many people had lost their income. The travel ban imposed in the region hit peasants and migrant workers the hardest. With no home to go to, some had retreated to closed underground stations. In her posts, Fun urged both officials and volunteers to help the weakest members of society. When she learned that other governments were offering citizens financial aid, she suggested the Chinese authorities should do something similar. She also called for an army of therapists to come to Wuhan after lockdown to ease the psychological stress and trauma of the pandemic.
Blink 7 of 7.
It wasn't until March, about 45 days into the lockdown, that the situation in Wuhan improved significantly. On March 7th, there were fewer than 100 new cases of coronavirus for the first time. Around 17,000 people remained in hospitals. Of those, 5,000 displayed serious symptoms. But now, all experts agreed that the virus was finally under control.
The key message here is, when the lockdown finally ended, the people of Wuhan rejoiced.
Bit by bit, life started to return to the city. First, mobile hospitals were disbanded. Then, all streets were disinfected. And finally, public transport started moving again. Even the airport was preparing to reopen. The people of Wuhan were overjoyed by the end of what had felt like an endless life in limbo. One by one, they started going back to work. Fun's colleagues at the Hubei Writers Association also began to return to their projects. Some of the old businesses returned to the streets of the province. But even as normal life was returning, the government's advice remained the same. Practice social distancing. Wash hands. Wear face masks. On March 19th, there were no new cases of infection in Wuhan for the first time ever. And that wasn't the only piece of good news that week. The Chinese government had finally agreed to give low-income households financial aid. A few days later, on March 24th, Fun ended her diary after exactly 60 entries. In her last posts, she commended the people of Wuhan for their bravery and persistence during the lockdown. She left the readers with some final thoughts. She saw the crisis as a lesson for China. The common fight against the coronavirus demonstrated the need for humankind to work together. Fun was deeply touched by the help Wuhan had received from the rest of China and from abroad. But she also felt that the Chinese government's habit of concealment and the arrogance of Western governments had both contributed to the loss of countless lives. On April 8th, Wuhan officially reopened. Fun noted that when the lockdown was lifted, there was barely a dry eye in the entire city. After 76 days of being stuck at home, stressed and confused by the raging epidemic, the people of Wuhan were finally able to return to their lives.
You've just listened to our links to Wuhan Diary by Fun.
The key messages in these blinks are that after the Wuhan government initially concealed the coronavirus outbreak, the strict lockdown of the city came as a shock to its residents. Seasoned writer Fun documented her quarantine experience in a public online diary, where she shared people's panic, despair, and anger during their long and arduous battle with the virus. But she also wrote about the hope and joy of the city's residents when the disease finally retreated and Wuhan came back to life.
Do you have some feedback for us? Because if you do, then we would love to hear what you think about our content.